line, the rectus femoris appears, and in a muscular subject its borders can be clearly defined when the muscle is in action. The vastus lateralis forms a long flattened plane traversed by the groove of the iliotibial band. The vastus medialis gives rise to a considerable prominence on the medial side of the lower half of the thigh. This prominence increases toward the knee, and ends somewhat abruptly with a full curved outline. The vastus intermedius is completely hidden. The adductores cannot be differentiated from one another, with the exception of the upper tendon of adductor longus and the lower tendon of adductor magnus. When the adductor longus is in action, its upper tendon stands out as a prominent ridge running obliquely downward and lateralward from the neighborhood of the pubic tubercle and forming the medial border of the femoral triangle. The lower tendon of adductor magnus can be distinctly felt as a short ridge extending downward between the sartorius and vastus medialis to the adductor tubercle. The adductores fill in the triangular space at the upper part of the thigh, between the femur and the pelvis, and to them is due the contour of the medial border of the thigh, the gracilis contributing largely to the smoothness of the outline. The gluteus maximus forms the full rounded outline of the buttock. It is more prominent behind, compressed in front, and ends at its tendinous insertion in a depression immediately behind the greater trochanter. Its lower border crosses the gluteal fold obliquely downward and lateralward. The upper is part of gluteus medius and is visible, but its lower part with gluteus minimus and the external rotators are completely hidden. From beneath the lower margin of gluteus maximus the hamstrings appear. At first they are narrow and not well defined, but as they descend they become more prominent and eventually divide into two well-marked ridges formed by their tendons. These constitute the upper boundaries of the popliteal fossa. The tendon of biceps femoris is a thick cord running to the head of the fibula. The tendons of the semimembranosus and semitendinosus, as they run medialward to the tibia, are separated by a slight furrow. The semitendinosus is the more medial, and can be felt in certain positions of the limb as a sharp cord, while the semimembranosus is thick and rounded. The gracilis is situated a little in front of them. The tibialis anterior presents a fusiform enlargement at the lateral side of the tibia, and projects beyond the anterior crest of the bone. Its tendon can be traced on the front of the tibia and ankle joint, and thence along the medial side of the foot to the base of the first metatarsal bone. The fleshy fibers of peroneus longus are strongly marked at the upper part of the lateral side of the leg. It is separated by furrows from extensor digitorum longus in front, and soleus behind. Below, the fleshy fibers end abruptly in a tendon which overlaps the more flattened elevation of peroneus brevis. Below the lateral malleolus, the tendon of peroneus brevis is the more marked. On the dorsum of the foot the tendons emerging from beneath the transverse and cruciate crural ligaments spread out and can be distinguished as follows. The most medial and largest is tibialis anterior. The next is extensor hallucis proprius, then extensor digitorum longus dividing into 4 tendons to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th toes, and lastly peroneus tertius. The extensor digitorum brevis produces a rounded outline on the dorsum of the foot and a fullness in front of the lateral malleolus. The interossei dorsalis bulge between the metatarsal bones. At the back of the knee is the popliteal fossa bounded above by the tendons of the hamstrings and below by the gastrocnemius. Below this fossa is the prominent fleshy mass of the calf of the leg produced by gastrocnemius and soleus. When these muscles are in action, the borders of gastrocnemius form 2 well-defined curved lines, which converge to the tendocalcaneus. The medial border is the more prominent. At the same time the edges of soleus can be seen forming, on either side of gastrocnemius, curved eminences, of which the lateral is the longer. The fleshy mass of the calf ends somewhat abruptly in the tendocalcaneus, which tapers in the upper 3/4 of its extent, but widens out slightly below. Behind the medial border of the lower part of the tibia, a well-defined ridge is produced by the tendon of tibialis posterior during contraction of the muscle. On the sole of the foot, the abductor digiti quinti forms a narrow rounded elevation on the lateral side, and the abductor hallucis a lesser elevation on the medial side. The flexor digitorum brevis, bound down by the plantar aponeurosis, is not very apparent; it produces a flattened form, and the thickened skin underlying it is thrown into numerous wrinkles. Arteries. The femoral artery, as it crosses the brim of the pelvis, is readily felt. In its course down the thigh, its pulsation becomes gradually more difficult of recognition. When the knee is flexed, the pulsation of the popliteal artery can easily be detected in the popliteal fossa. On the lower part of the front of the tibia, the anterior tibial artery becomes superficial and can be traced over the ankle into the dorsalis pedis. The latter can be followed to the proximal end of the first intermetatarsal space. The pulsation of the posterior tibial artery becomes evident near the lower end of the back of the tibia, and is easily detected behind the medial malleolus. Veins. By compressing the proximal trunks, the venous arch on the dorsum of the foot, together with the great and small saphenous veins leading from it, are rendered visible. Nerves. The only nerve of the lower extremity which can be located by palpation is the common perineal as it winds around the lateral side of the neck of the fibula. End of section 58.